The bustling chaos of New Year's Eve filled the streets of New York City. Bright lights flashed from every screen in Times Square, each billboard and advertisement vying for attention. The air vibrated with music, laughter, and the growing excitement of millions counting down the hours until the ball drop. But for Sam Walker, standing at the edge of the crowd, the night felt anything but celebratory. Sam wasn't here for the festivities. He wasn't here to cheer with strangers or sip champagne under the glow of the giant crystal ball. He had come for answers, or perhaps for closure. For months, he had been drawn to the dark history of Times Square, a history few knew existed. It began innocently enough. Sam, a freelance historian struggling to keep his career afloat, had stumbled upon an obscure reference in an old New York City archive. The entry mentioned a curse tied to the very first New Year's Eve ball drop in 1907. At first, he dismissed it as folklore, one of the countless urban legends woven into the fabric of the city. But as he dug deeper, he found disturbing patterns, strange disappearances, accounts of people vanishing without a trace during the celebration. Witnesses described shadowy figures that moved against the light, defying explanation. And then there was the journal. Sam had found it tucked away in a forgotten corner of the archive, its pages brittle with age. Written in a hurried, panicked scrawl, it recounted the story of a man named Henry Klein, a construction worker who had helped build the first ball. According to the journal, Henry and his team uncovered something buried deep beneath the site of Times Square, something that shouldn't have been unearthed. "We disturbed their rest," one entry read. "They warned us, but we didn't listen. Now they watch and wait." The final entry was chilling. "If you see the ball drop, do not look at the light. It will call to you, and you will never return." Sam couldn't shake the feeling that Henry's words were more than the ramblings of a paranoid man. The further he delved, the more he felt the pull of the mystery. Against his better judgment, he decided to come to Times Square and witness the ball drop for himself. The countdown clock displayed 1 hour until midnight. Sam adjusted the scarf around his neck, his breath visible in the cold night air. The crowd pressed around him, a sea of faces lost in joy and excitement. He felt like an intruder, an outsider carrying a secret none of them could fathom. In his pocket, Sam's fingers brushed against the cold metal of an old medallion, a relic he had found tucked inside Henry's journal. The medallion was engraved with strange symbols that seemed to shift when viewed in the light. He had no idea what it was or why Henry had kept it, but something about it felt important. Protective, even. As the minutes ticked by, Sam's unease grew. He scanned the crowd, searching for anything unusual. At first, everything seemed normal. Groups of friends taking selfies, vendors selling overpriced snacks, children laughing on their parents' shoulders. But then he saw them. At the edge of the square, barely visible in the shadows, stood 3 figures. They didn't move, didn't cheer, didn't interact with anyone around them. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were empty. Sam blinked, and they were gone. The crowd erupted into cheers as the final 10 minutes were announced. Sam's heart pounded. He tried to tell himself that he was imagining things, that the stress of his research was getting to him, but deep down, he knew better. He felt it before he saw it. A cold, creeping sensation that started at the base of his spine and worked its way up to his neck. Slowly, he turned around. Standing just a few feet away was one of the figures he had seen earlier. Its face was featureless, its form shrouded in a dark mist. It raised an arm, pointing directly at him. "Leave," a voice whispered, though no mouth moved. "You don't belong here." Sam stumbled backward, bumping into the people behind him. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "See what?" a woman replied, frowning at him. She followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. Before Sam could respond, the final countdown began. 10, 9, 8 exclamation mark. He turned back to the figure, but it had vanished. The crowd around him screamed with excitement, their voices drowning out his rising panic. 3, 2, 1! Exclamation mark! The ball reached the bottom of its descent, and a blinding flash of light consumed the square. Sam shielded his eyes, but the light was everywhere, piercing and unnatural. When he lowered his arm, the world around him had changed. The once cheering crowd was silent. The bright screens of Times Square were dark, their glow replaced by a dull, pulsing red. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the figures were everywhere now, dozens of them, their hollow eyes fixed on Sam. This was no celebration. This was a warning, a message from the past that had finally caught up to the present. The silence was deafening. Sam stood frozen in the center of Times Square, his breath visible in the cold night air. Around him, the vibrant cityscape was replaced by something alien and wrong. The massive LED screens that once displayed colorful advertisements now flickered with distorted images. Snatches of faces, long forgotten, appeared and vanished, their eyes filled with sorrow and accusation. The ball above, no longer bright and celebratory, pulsed with a faint, unnatural glow, casting long, menacing shadows across the square. Sam's grip tightened on the medallion in his pocket. Its surface felt warm now, as if alive. He pulled it out, staring at the engraved symbols. The shapes seemed to shift before his eyes, rearranging themselves into a pattern he couldn't decipher. "You shouldn't have stayed," a voice whispered, low and guttural. Sam turned sharply. One of the shadowy figures had moved closer. It stood at the edge of his vision, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. It wasn't walking, more like gliding, as if carried by an unseen current. The figure raised an arm, pointing a skeletal finger at Sam. "You brought this upon yourself," it said, its voice like a hiss of steam. Panic set in. Sam staggered backward, bumping into something solid. He spun around to see another figure, this one taller and more menacing. Its face was blank, its body wrapped in tattered cloth that fluttered despite the still air. Behind it, more figures began to emerge, stepping out of the shadows as if birthed by the darkness itself. They didn't make a sound, but their hollow eyes bore into him. Sam's instincts kicked in. He turned and ran, weaving through the empty square. The once celebratory space now felt like a labyrinth, the shadows closing in around him. Every corner he turned seemed to lead him deeper into the suffocating darkness. The journal's words echoed in his mind. "Seek the place where it all began. Only there can the light defeat the darkness." But where? The Times Tower. It had to be the old building where the first ball drop took place. Sam scanned the square, searching for a sign of the tower. In the distance, he saw it. The structure was barely visible, shrouded in a dense fog that clung to its edges. It loomed like a phantom, its silhouette jagged and warped. Sam sprinted toward it, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the silence. The figures followed. Though they moved slowly, they never fell behind, as if the space itself bent to their will. Sam reached the entrance of the tower and tried the door. Locked. He yanked at the handle, desperation mounting. "Let me in!" he shouted, pounding on the heavy wood. The medallion in his hand began to glow faintly, its warmth intensifying. Acting on instinct, Sam pressed it against the door. With a metallic groan, the lock gave way, and the door creaked open. He stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind him. The interior of the Times Tower was suffocatingly dark. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, and the walls were lined with old photographs, images of Times Square from its earliest days. Sam held his phone's flashlight up to one of the pictures. It depicted a group of workers constructing the first New Year's ball. Their faces were serious, their eyes haunted. He recognized one of them immediately, Henry Klein. The photograph seemed to pulse under the beam of light, and for a moment, Sam thought the workers' faces moved. He stepped back, his pulse quickening. The journal hadn't lied. This place was steeped in the curse. As he moved deeper into the tower, the glow from the medallion grew stronger. It seemed to pull him forward, guiding him up a spiral staircase that groaned under his weight. The further he climbed, the louder the whispers became. They came from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding him in a cacophony of voices. "You cannot escape," they said. "Your time has come. The past will claim you." Sam reached the top of the staircase where an old room awaited. At its center stood the original New Year's ball, covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. The once brilliant crystals were cracked and dulled, their light long extinguished. Around it, strange symbols were carved into the floor, matching those on the medallion. As Sam approached the ball, the whispers grew louder, almost unbearable. He placed the medallion on the pedestal beside it. The room trembled, and a blinding light erupted from the ball, illuminating the space. The shadowy figures appeared again, but this time they recoiled from the light. Their forms twisted and writhed, their hollow eyes filled with anguish. The medallion began to melt, its liquid form seeping into the ball's surface. But something was wrong. The light dimmed, flickering erratically. A deep, resonant voice filled the room, one that seemed to come from the ball itself. "You cannot undo what has been done," it said. "The past will not be silenced." The room went dark. Sam felt a cold hand grasp his shoulder. When he turned, he was face to face with a figure unlike the others. This one was larger, its form more defined. Its eyes glowed a fiery red, and its presence radiated pure malice. "You thought you could stop it," the figure said, its voice like grinding stone. "But the clock always strikes midnight." Sam screamed as the figure lunged at him, its form engulfing him in darkness. The next morning, Times Square was bustling as usual, with tourists taking selfies and vendors selling souvenirs. The celebration had ended without incident, but the scorch mark on the base of the crystal ball remained, unnoticed by all. And Sam Walker? He was never seen again. But somewhere, deep beneath the city, the curse lingered, waiting for its next victim. The darkness was absolute. Sam's scream was swallowed by the void as the figure's cold, skeletal hands gripped his shoulders. The medallion, now embedded into the glowing crystal ball, pulsed faintly, its light struggling against the encroaching shadows. For a moment, it felt like the world had ceased to exist. Sam couldn't feel the ground beneath his feet or the air in his lungs. The only sound was the deep, resonant voice of the figure, its words dripping with malice. "Time is a circle, Sam Walker, and you've stepped into its darkest loop." The light of the medallion flickered, revealing the room once more. The shadowy figure had retreated, but its presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. Sam stumbled back, his eyes darting to the crystal ball. The strange liquid from the melted medallion had seeped into its cracks, and the light within was growing unstable, casting wild, erratic beams across the room. "Stop this!" Sam shouted, his voice trembling. "I didn't ask for this!" The photographs on the walls came alive, their subjects moving and twisting in unnatural ways. The faces of long-dead workers, partygoers, and passers-by all turned toward Sam, their expressions a mix of anger and despair. Their whispers filled the air, a chorus of voices overlapping and growing louder. "You were warned. You disturbed the cycle. The past demands its due." Sam clutched his head, overwhelmed by the noise. He dropped to his knees, his eyes locked on the ball. It was the key, he realized. Everything revolved around it. The curse, the shadows, the voices. They all emanated from this one object. He crawled toward the pedestal, ignoring the icy tendrils of darkness that snaked across the floor, reaching for him. As he placed his hands on the ball, a surge of energy shot through him, burning his skin. The symbols on the floor began to glow, their patterns shifting and intertwining, forming a spiral that seemed to stretch into infinity. the shadowy figure reappeared, standing just beyond the circle of symbols. Its red eyes burned with fury. "You cannot contain what was unleashed," it said, its voice reverberating through the room. "You cannot undo what was done." Sam gritted his teeth, his hands trembling as he tried to lift the ball. It was impossibly heavy, as though it was rooted to the pedestal. The whispers grew louder, and the photographs on the walls began to fall, crashing to the floor in a cascade of shattered glass. "Help me!" Sam screamed, though he didn't know who he was calling out to. The ball pulsed again, brighter this time, and the room seemed to shift. For a brief moment, Sam saw flashes of the past, workers laying bricks, partygoers celebrating the first New Year's Eve ball drop, and Henry Klein clutching the medallion, his face twisted in terror. Then, the shadows attacked. They surged forward, their forms merging into a single massive entity that loomed over Sam. It raised an arm, its hand transforming into a blade of darkness. Sam closed his eyes, bracing for the end. But then, the ball shattered. The explosion of light was blinding, tearing through the darkness like 1,000 suns. The shadowy figure let out an ear-piercing scream as it was engulfed, its form dissolving into nothingness. The room shook violently, the walls cracking and splintering as the energy from the ball consumed everything in its path. Sam was thrown backward, hitting the ground hard. When he opened his eyes, he was back in Times Square. The crowd was cheering, the lights were bright, and the crystal ball above was descending as though nothing had happened. For a moment, Sam thought it was over. He felt the medallion in his pocket, its surface cool and unremarkable. But then he noticed the scorch mark on his palm, the same pattern as the symbols on the floor of the tower. He looked around, searching for any sign of what had occurred. But the crowd was oblivious, celebrating the arrival of the new year. Sam stood there frozen as the countdown began again. 10, 9, 8. A hand tapped his shoulder. He turned to see a young boy, no older than 8, holding a familiar medallion. The boy's eyes were dark, his expression blank. "It's your turn now," he said, his voice echoing with the same guttural tone as the shadowy figure. Sam backed away, his heart pounding. The boy placed the medallion in his hand and vanished into the crowd. 3, 2, 1! The ball dropped, and the light engulfed him once more. The next morning, Times Square was bustling as usual, with tourists taking selfies and vendors selling souvenirs. The celebration had ended without incident, but the scorch mark on the base of the crystal ball remained, unnoticed by all. And Sam Walker? He was never seen again. But somewhere, deep beneath the city, the curse lingered, waiting for its next victim.